Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Chelsea Shetler. I'm on the Partner Marketing team here at Marketo, and I will be introducing our host for today. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and can be viewed at the same confirmation link you received by email at the conclusion of the webcast. We will make time for Q&A towards the end of our 30 minutes, so please do not hesitate to submit any questions you have for our speakers via the box to the right of the viewer. If we do not get to your question in time today, we are happy to reach out to you personally. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Mika Yamamoto, VP GM of Marketo, an Adobe company, and Adam Needle, CEO of ANNUITAS. Mika joined Marketo in 2018 as Global President. She focuses on driving growth at scale by delivering a world-class end-to-end customer experience, overseeing the management of strategy, operations, and execution at Marketo, with accountability for the entire organization. Before joining, Mika was the first Chief Digital Marketing Officer for SAP, driving their digital transformation by leading the strategy and execution of SAP's demand generation, marketing tools and technology, and field marketing disciplines. Adam is CEO of ANNUITAS, a demand generation firm that helps B2B marketing and sales leaders at enterprise organizations build and execute demand generation that is buyer-centric. Prior to this role, he spent 4.5 years serving as Chief Strategy Officer and is the architect of the company's core demand process methodology. He's an expert in helping companies build buyer-driven, perpetual demand generation programs and transform their lead-to-revenue processes to drive profitable revenue growth and build sustainable brands. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Mika, I would like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chelsea. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be covering today. First of all, just setting it up, just kind of characterizing where we are as marketers. Like Chelsea said, currently driving inside of Marketo, but have spent much of my career as a practitioner, so playing the role that many of you are playing as marketers, and so setting up kind of where we are today as marketers in terms of how do we engage with our customers. And then getting into what are some of the best practices that we see great companies leverage to be able to connect with those customers. And there's those remarkable differences between good and great, and we'll get into those as we look at the best practices. And then talking about you specifically and how do you take advantage of some of the best practices and drive change within your own organizations. And then lastly, just talking about where to start. And then, of course, we're going to wrap, as Chelsea said, with some questions. So in terms of setting us up, I think that all of us are on a different point in time in terms of our digital transformation. We all know that we need to engage with our customers digitally. The one element is, where are you on that journey and how ready are you from an organization standpoint to do so? And so I think that what, we've noticed as Marketo, and again, when I was a Chief Digital Marketing Officer or heading marketing at Amazon or at Microsoft, really a lot of conversations with a lot of my peers is that we commit a lot of random acts of demand marketing today. We do a lot of activity, and I think a lot of us from the difference between folks that are good marketers versus great marketers is that we end up driving a lot less random acts and a lot more intentional acts that actually drive value for our customers. Case in point, 82% of demand marketing is the wrong place at the wrong time, which means that a lot of CMOs, when we actually pull a lot of us as practitioners, CMOs will actually self-report and say that fewer than 18% of the folks that they're reaching out to are actually in market for a specific product, service, or an offer, which means that our hit rate is actually really low. So the actual business that we close on the people we reach out to is precipitously low. And so what if we actually worked harder on figuring out the context and the information about the folks we're reaching out to so that we have more contextually relevant outreach and more contextually relevant connections with our customers. And so another piece also, aside from understanding where our customers sit and who our customers are and who we're actually reaching out to, making sure that people are receptive to the message that we're trying to communicate, is also internally. As we think about internally within our own companies, often we find the difference between good and great is that great companies actually drive much tighter alignment with other functions within the company. And so looking at non-marketing, for example, IT, non-sales business leaders within the company, how does marketing actually align with those functions? We see that very few marketers actually align with those functions. And it's reflected if you interview those functions and look at sales leaders. A lot of sales leaders will say that a brand-focused CMO thinks that marketing is focused on the wrong metrics. And so we have to shift our mindset, and it doesn't mean that we don't focus on branding. We're not saying that at all. We have to be able to start separating the metrics that we actually drive towards building our brand and awareness and the metrics that we're actually driving to drive demand. And where those actually are shared metrics and metrics that we actually drive alongside sales, we see much better alignment and a lot less he said, she said, and a lot more volume, velocity, and results-driven behavior across the functions within an organization. And so if we think about that digital transformation and we think about getting to the best practices, what we have to think about is the buyer journey. It started off by talking about where we are in terms of random acts of marketing. What we have to understand, and then we also talked about the impact of that, and if we're random and if we're pinging people and we don't even know where they sit in terms of their mindset on being ready to buy, or their mindset in terms of where they sit from a vertical standpoint, what else they might own, we actually aren't very targeted and we're not very contextually relevant. And so when we actually take into consideration where our customers or prospects are on the buyer journey, who they are, what they might be buying, what their situation is, we can then actually set a far better foundation to personalize the messages that we actually have, that we focus on with our customers, and then drive best-in-class marketing and move from good to great. And so I'll pass it on now to talk about some of those best practices and thinking about very deliberately that buyer journey and how we can engage a lot more deliberately for more contextually relevant engagement.
Thanks,
Adam?
Mika. And thanks, Mika. And I think those are some great insights. I think what that really sets the stage for us to then ask the question, how do we translate a buying process, how do we translate making the buying process the foundation for demand marketing? How do we actually operationalize on that? What does that mean for our demand marketing organization? Aligning on a buyer journey, having the buying process really drive our demand marketing doesn't just mean that we have relevant messages for the buyer. It doesn't just mean that, we segment different offerings for different buyers. Obviously, that's all sort of tactical relevance, but it actually means that the entire apparatus of people, process, and content and technology that are wrapped around the buyer have to be fully engaged around that buyer at every stage. One area, for example, is that sales and marketing interactions can't just be coordinated, they have to be orchestrated. And every touch point has to be meaningful towards driving a buyer forward in their process and engaging with a buyer when and where they are in their process. Whenever we look at organizational strategy, look at technology systems, we need to make sure that there's clear stewardship, right? One of the things we frequently see is organizational strategy where we have functional alignments, but we don't actually have process alignment. So we actually have gaps. So the question is, who's the steward of the buyer at every stage at a sales and marketing level? There are times, unfortunately, when org strategies are such that there's times that the org strategy is such that there are actually sales and marketing people that don't have that responsibility. And the same thing's got to be with the stack. The stack absolutely has to, at every stage, be rationalized against that process, and technology needs to support that buyer journey, right, not actually dictate what we're doing. The thing about organizations that invest in and put a buyer-centric demand process at the center of the demand marketing is that they see a substantial return and improvement. The average organization from a lead to revenue standpoint, from, let's say, inquiry to close one, is actually operating at about a 0.3% conversion rate. And that's a really important number because that's not a very efficient rate. But what we do see is organizations that start to take this approach of bringing people, process, content, technology, wrap it around a buying process so that truly you have a buyer-centric go-to-market process. They start to see rapid improvement. For us at Annuitas, we've been, from a data science level, doing work in the space for a number of years and measuring the impact. And we see organizations that first start to tackle this in year one have a dramatic improvement. And we see organizations that get into year two and continue to mature go up multiple fold above that. And for us, the average mature organization that's really engaging, putting the buyer in the center, seeing about a 10x improvement on their demand marketing ROI. And what does that fundamentally mean? they're driving 10 times more close one for every person that goes in the top of the funnel than their peers in the marketplace, and that's pretty substantial. The irony is all that at some level speaks to is how inefficient we are today. Mika talked about this earlier, right? There's this arbitrage opportunity to be more right place, right time, and when we're more right place, right time, it has a huge impact on our ability to drive that ROI and to drive the close one revenue. Okay, so how do you drive this change? We know, and Mika talked about this a little bit earlier, traditional tactical demand marketing activities have led to a state where we fail more than we succeed at meaningfully connecting with and converting prospects and customers. That's why we've got to have a very clear charter in demand marketing to really drive this digital demand transformation. But the question is, how do we drive that transformation? So I want to talk about 5 elements for driving that transformation. I want to talk about operationalizing around the buyer, integrating content marketing and lead management, shifting to a perpetual state, optimizing against outcomes, and then I want to talk about what we refer to as how you can demand rationalize the technology stack. I hinted at this a little bit earlier, but we'll go deeper, and Mika will also talk about how can your technology stack truly empower a buyer-centric demand process. Okay, operationalizing around the buyer. The curve that you're looking at right now is a distribution, right? And it's sort of showing in the marketplace where most B2B and demand marketing organizations are. And what we see is a tremendous amount of organizations, as Mika mentioned earlier, are still very much in this tactical state. And what defines this tactical state? They're very much driving an inside-out approach to go-to-market, right? They are pushing out their product. They're driving out interruptive messages. They're very much an outbound direct response posture. We refer to that as tactical demand. And what we're talking about here when we talk about operationalizing around the buyer is moving into what we refer to as a strategic demand state. And what is that strategic demand state? That is about really being more sensitive to buyer pull. That's about much more of an inbound orientation, orchestrating multi-touch interactions at the right place, right time for the buyer, and being much more always on. Engaging with the buyer so that your demand gen stance is much more of a perpetual ongoing where you're engaging right place, right time, as opposed to pushing whenever it's convenient for the campaign of the day. So what does that actually mean when you talk about operationalizing it? So first of all, obviously the buying process, as you see here, has to be foundational. And then the core is, what is the dialogue you need to be driving with the buyer, right? So that sort of is the top level of the stack. What's the conversation end to end? What's really interesting is, and I'll talk about this in a minute when we talk about content marketing lead management, if you understand the conversation with the buyer, understand the questions that they have, you're better able to propel that forward with the right content, the right channels, and subsequently better qualify them. And that's where your content marketing's got to mirror that, but your lead management framework has to as well. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in depth in a minute. Marketing sales roles need to be supporting that. When you have that clear demand process and you've got a clear sense of demand process stewardship, buyer stewardship, end-to-end, those roles need to be defined in terms of the process they're supporting, not in terms of function. So, for instance, someone operating in a lead development team, not somebody saying, hey, I'm driving sales outreach, right? So instead of it being about the activity, it's about the role in the process. And then again, we'll talk a little bit more about the technology side. A really critical piece of this is integrating content marketing and lead management. And I think this is a real challenge for a lot of organizations. Certainly, there is best-in-class content marketing that is about making sure that we're engaging the buyer, that is absolutely about making sure that we have compelling content that's out there. But what we really need to do is understand the end-to-end set of questions that a buyer has and have a complete, meaning zero gaps, content marketing framework so that we have content that addresses every question in every stage. What that then enables us to do is to not only have the conversation, but, and this is the important piece, to then have the interaction with that content tell us something about where they are on their buyer journey. If they're consuming lower funnel content, if they're indicating they're in a later stage of process, that needs to impact their qualification. So instead of lead management being just about the types of organizations we want to engage with or the types of roles we want to engage with, which far too often a lot of the scoring contexts that get deployed are that, we need to think about a much more dynamic sense of lead management, which is certainly about engaging with the right people, but it's also about their engagement and where they are in their buying process. So what happens is when you really engage content marketing and lead management working together, it becomes a dialogue. It becomes a two-way interaction where content marketing is going out to the buyer. You're seeing engaging the interaction with it, and based on what they interact with and how they respond back, and through things like progressive profiling and scoring, we can then assess where they are in their lead process. Then what we start to do is adapt our lead qualification to be actually a mirror of what that conversation is. And in terms of operationalizing this, we need to have context. We need to have frameworks that allow us to do both. And so this means on the left-hand side, making sure your content marketing framework is fully aligned with your lead management model. And then similarly, your progressive profiling isn't haphazard, but actually is about understanding where buyers are in their journey and qualifying based on state. So another piece here is that we need to shift to a perpetual state. And this is a really important piece. We've been working on this for a number of years, and we have a framework around perpetual demand generation. But the fundamental idea here is we need to understand where buyers are, and we need to be responsive and respectful of where they are in their process. And so instead of hitting them with certain offers because we're campaigning at that moment, we need to actually have things be much more triggered and engaged. And so what you want to be is in a state where, first of all, you differentiate your different personas. But second, as they move through their process, you have a different set of interactions based on what you know to be their content interests and channel interests as they move through that process. So what you want to be able to do is to trigger different pieces. A great example is field marketing. Far too often, enterprise field marketing is deployed in such a way that somebody in marketing is working with a salesperson. Hey, who are the people we want to invite, that we want to engage? And we use it as an engagement tactic. But whenever you're operating in a perpetual state, it's interesting to think about, what if you have an event that you do every month, and it's about addressing a certain set of questions and needs that are a certain part of the certain stage in the buying process? And what if the people that you invite to that are actually the folks who are at that stage in the process at any given point in the month? So instead of saying, hey, here's a set of companies in some region we want to go after, you actually filter and say, hey, the people we want to invite are the people who are at that stage. And you think about field marketing as actually being a nurture touch, as actually a part on the journey. One of the other things that you've got to be able to do is you've got to be able to adapt and slow down. And so you see these loops here where buyers are also recycling back. Slowing down or turning someone back to nurture isn't just, sending them some sort of drip email. It's about slowing the pace of engagement. It's about de-escalating the content, maybe going to a higher order content piece, a more thought leadership piece, because a buyer's not yet at a later stage. Perpetual engagement is about that adaptive view. It's also about timeline. And this is a really important piece, because whenever you look at, so this is actually an actual, names have been changed to protect the innocent here, but this is actually a buyer with an actual client program with a critical path that we've run through with them, where they were interacting through a number of different engagement channels, and this actually was powered by Marketo. As you see, this person over time engages. First, they're on a house list that they had opted into and download some content. Then they get their lead management stage gets advanced. They get some more nurture pieces. They continue to move through the process. What you probably don't notice, but I notice as I look at this, is that the coding of the content pieces indicates they're going further and further down into the process. They come back to the website, so now they're hitting email, they're hitting website. They engage with an e-newsletter. There's multiple content pieces that are engaged, and eventually they get generated as a lead. So instead of the first time that they submitted a content piece, this immediately goes to MQL and someone calls them, we actually nurtured them forward, and whenever we knew that they were engaging in a later funnel state, we had someone reach out to them. And then you see here that in a couple of months following, it converted to an opportunity and then was a closed one. What's most remarkable about this is that this took nearly a year. And when you have a perpetual state, that's okay, because the fact is that we were in the right place at the right time and converted that, and that's really our opportunity, as opposed to hurrying buyers along. two other points here. One is this idea of we need to optimize against outcomes. And what do we mean by optimizing against outcomes? Really two things. One is you see on the left-hand side, we need to make sure the points of interaction are driven to a critical path. And so on the left-hand side, you see some analysis where we're actually looking at content pieces and looking at the average velocity or throughput time between consumption of the content piece and whenever the buyer actually went to close one. And you see that for content piece and also for channels. This is critical piece of outcome to say, hey, what were the points of interaction and what stages, what journey? We might have hypothesized what we thought, what content went with what stages, but when you actually observe and see buyers and you look at the outcome for someone who's gone to a successful close one, you're able to actually look at that journey and optimize against it. Similarly, whenever you're looking at the channels and content that you're engaging, whenever you're assessing program effectiveness, and you see this on the right-hand side, you need to be able to look at what the close one effects were. Frequently, demand marketing teams will say, hey, we deployed this program. It was, I'm just making stuff up. It was PPC or it was a white paper program. Look at all these MQLs we generated. But how many close ones did we generate, right? At the end of the day, that's a key piece to making our investment in those channels and content pieces be more about engaging the right buyer. The last piece here is that we've got to do something that we call demand rationalizing the technology stack. And what does that mean? First of all, you need a stack. First of all, no one platform by itself is enough, right? You're driving a demand process. There's multiple points of interaction. Different platforms play different roles. For example, CRM, often Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics as examples, are that's really the interface that sales are interacting through. They're managing pipeline. That's really the sales UX, right? So we need to optimize a lot of the things that are happening in the process from the sales standpoint to CRM. Similarly, the buyer's interacting through smart web pages, and so the web CMS really needs to be rationalized to the role that it's playing. But marketing automation has a really unique role in this because it's the only platform that is able to bring together all those interactions, it's able to trigger and qualify in real time, and to build something that we call a data value chain, which is as you take points of interaction, you composite and build a more and more complete view of the buyer, and then transmit that to CRM. And so it's important when you look at your tech stack to A, have a complete stack, but B, make sure that all the different systems are playing roles that are clear roles in the process. Okay, so we've been progressing through here talking about the 5 different things that you should tackle from a digital demand transformation standpoint. Where do you start, right? There's a lot to do here. So a couple of things. First of all, it goes without saying, but understanding your buyers, their segmentation, their journeys is a critical first step in all of this. And that's going to really help you better understand all the pieces and how they're going to fit together. Subsequently, tying content stage behaviors to qualification criteria, right? Content tells us something about where the buyer is, and that's critical to lead management. It's also critical to looking at gaps in our stack at a people, process, content, technology level. We need to better leverage our technology strategically, and particularly marketing automation, to be a keystone in the mix. But I think the last piece that I would say is that you can't do this overnight. It takes a while. You need to have a sense of and a phased approach to building maturity. Mika, I'm sure you have a couple other comments on this, and I know you've got a couple other thoughts before we wrap up here, so I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I think the biggest element, because I think that there's such a massive opportunity for us as marketers. You talked about progressive profiling. You talked about putting customers on different paths based on where they are and how they've interacted with the company, and also some third-party data that they are potentially that's potentially available to give us some insights on how to best interact with our customers. I think the biggest piece is to understand where you are as a company in building your tech stack. Adam had talked about you need a stack. Knowing what stack to have really depends on where you are in your digital transformation. I know that when I was a chief digital marketing officer, I really aspirationally wanted to be where my peer was in building a digital demand center. One of my peers that I looked to was Steph Ferguson, who led the digital demand center at Microsoft. Well, she was a level 3 or 4, and I wanted to be there, but there's no way I could have gotten there without actually going through levels 1 and 2. And so aspirationally, I think you have to have an idea of where you're going. But I think you have to level set in terms of where you are and build that stack and start with foundational elements first and then graduate your way onto the next area. Because as Adam had said, this isn't just a component of a MarTech stack. You need the right content, you need the right metrics, you need the right people. So it's a component of processes and technology and of competencies within your company. So I think that where to start is really thinking about where you are from a maturity standpoint, where you sit and where you aspirationally want to go, and creating a path for how you get there and building that stack accordingly. And with that, I'd love to, Adam and I, on behalf of Adam and I, we'd love to turn it over and see what questions you all might have.
Yes, we have one. Tamika, what is the most important component of success for digital transformation?
So one of the things that I know that initially I had taken for granted and not taken seriously enough was the need to have a culture that is actually ready for digital transformation. So we moved at SAP from a place where we were moving to 6 to 12-week campaigns to actually dynamically iterating on campaigns on an hourly basis during the day. And in order to do that, you have to shift a finance organization, an IT organization, a marketing organization, to actually be able to respond in that way, as well as the relationships you have with your agencies. And so that I definitely took for granted how much heavy lifting that would take to move to a metrics-based, hours, like needing data within hours versus within weeks. Moving that transformation wasn't just a notion of investing in technology. It was a notion of investing in people and changing the culture accordingly to be able to take advantage of the great technologies that was out there.
To Adam, with your models and best practices, how does Marketo play into all this versus other platforms?
Marketo is A, incredibly robust, B, enables us to bring together a tremendous amount of buyer insight and data into one place. One of the things that, it's hard to explain this, I think, quite frankly, to marketers sometimes, but technically it's taking all of these channel interactions, all of these points of interaction the buyer's having in a content, a channel, at a lead management level, bring it together in real time, and then enabling us to trigger. It literally needs to be, marketing automation needs to be the brain where it's triggering different channels, where it's actually sitting at the center of your webinar platform, sitting at the center of your web, sitting at the center of your events platform. It's all going to be working together. And we find that Marketo does a really good job of that because of, A, the engineering architecture is operating and available, but B, it actually has the complexity built in to see all this and the logic to see all this. So, we really enjoy working with the Marketo platform.
Awesome. Tamika, you mentioned that sales leaders sometimes feel that marketing is focused on the wrong metrics. Can you give an example?
So we often see the metrics of being able to say that marketing often has an opportunity to create metric of saying this is how many MQLs we have. But often within sales organizations, we don't see an agreement on what qualifies as an MQL to be able to convert over to an SQL, a sales qualified lead. And so we see a lot of mistrust between marketing and sales, marketing saying, we handed you over a ton of opportunities, sales saying, well, what you handed over to us wasn't quality, and therefore we don't trust what you give us, so we have to go create our own opportunities ourselves. And so there is an opportunity to, number one, actually come up with mutual scoring so that there's an agreement to what actually qualifies as a marketing qualified lead before it gets handed over to sales. So there's some trust and some skin in the game in terms of defining what an MQL is by sales. And then also what I found really effective is putting marketing on the hook and on the hook for actually the number of SQLs that actually get created, so sales qualified lead, and also putting them accountable to actually some of the closed won number as well. So they are actually on the hook for driving the revenues or the bookings, as well as the actual marketing functions themselves. And I found that actually plays in spades trust with the sales organization and then drives alignment in terms of what we're trying to drive in terms of the end outcome with the customer.
Perfect. And it looks like we have about 1 minute left, but Adam, I want to give you the final question here. In regards to this digital transformation, who's doing it well, companies and or industries?
So a couple of things. One, I would actually say a lot of tech industry players are not doing as well as they think because they often just adopt technology and think that's a cure for a better process. We actually see some more traditional industries, in the media space. We see healthcare, financial services are actually rapidly moving into and going through transformation. They've been a little bit slower than in the tech space, but they're actually taking a little bit more thoughtful approach to this, and I think are building more sustainability. At the end of the day, technology is not a solution. Having a better go-to-market process that works all the time is the solution. And so without naming names, I'll say that some more traditional industries, we actually see having some better examples of getting there.
Awesome. Perfect. I want to thank you again both for joining us today. And on behalf of the Marketo and ANNUITAS team, everyone, have an awesome rest of the day, and thank you so much for viewing our webcast.
Thank you for joining, everybody.